Here's the thing. We know exactly the kind of horrors Russia is capable of enacting on a civilian population because we have seen it before. The Syrian civil war began 11 years ago today, actually, on this very day. And a few years later, in 2015, Russia entered the fray to help prop up Syria's embattled dictator, Bashar al-Assad. Russia's involvement in the conflict took things from bad to worse. Russian President Vladimir Putin used the same strategy we are seeing now of indiscriminate bombing. Civilians and residential homes were routinely targeted by Russian and Syrian forces, especially in the once thriving city of Aleppo, which was essentially, as you see on your screen there, destroyed, reduced to rubble. Russia allegedly used the same kind of illegal cluster bombs they are now using to target civilians in Ukraine. And Russian forces also deliberately targeted hospitals as part of their bombing campaign, according to a thorough New York Times investigation, at one point destroying 4 of them in just one 12-hour span. This reign of terror forced millions of Syrians to flee the country, more than 6.6 million so far, many of whom fled to Europe. And it created the worst refugee crisis we had seen in years and caused ripple effects throughout the entire world. At the same time, the conflict in Syria, exacerbated by Russia's involvement, left an opportunity for the terror group ISIS to come to power, unleashing its own horrors in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the combination of ISIS's rise and the European migrant crisis are the precipitating incidents for the right-wing populist backlash against immigration that essentially took over Europe and much of the West starting in the late 2010s. Hungary's notorious and aspiring authoritarian leader Viktor Orban, a hero among many on the American right, used the refugee crisis quite explicitly as a wedge issue to consolidate his own support. He called refugees invaders and compared migration to a poison. Poland's right-wing nationalist party, known as Law and Justice, also used the crisis to score political points by refusing to take in refugees from Syria, claiming that doing so would be a threat to national security. Nigel Farage and other right-wing politicians in the UK, look at that photo, right? Look at that billboard. They used the refugee crisis as one of the main arguments in favor of what? Of breaking with the European Union in Brexit. With the Council of European Studies citing immigration as a single most important factor for those who voted to leave the EU. The populist backlash against these desperate people fleeing the war in Syria that Russia was prosecuting, it also fueled unsuccessful bids from far-right parties, such as Netherlands' Party for Freedom, or the French party, known as the National Rally. And then there's here in the U.S., of course. It was those images. It was the specter of a refugee crisis. It was a major factor enabling Donald Trump's rise to power. You might not remember this now, but during the campaign, Trump's son, Don Jr., tweeted out this disgusting racist meme comparing refugees from Syria to poison candy. One of Trump's key campaign promises was, quote, of course, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. Although it is worth noting, amid all the backlash, Germany's then Chancellor Angela Merkel accepted 1 million refugees, mostly from Syria. In many ways, the Russian involvement in Syria was the kind of butterfly wings flapping that led to this populist moment, this resentment, this buildup of nationalist populist parties and candidates and regimes and governments. And perhaps unintentionally created a new flood of right-wing politicians, either explicitly or implicitly aligned with Putin and the Kremlin themselves, from Farage to Orban to Trump. So we find ourselves here again, though, with a situation quite different in certain respects, an interesting contrast. For many reasons, including, frankly, racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, the paranoia of post-9/11 war on terror. Many of those same countries which quite explicitly refused to accept refugees that Russia created in Syria are, to their credit, opening their borders and opening their arms to the refugees Russia is creating in Ukraine. In fact, just today, Poland's right-wing prime minister, along with the PMs from Slovenia and the Czech Republic, met with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Kyiv, traveling into the war zone. I mean, there were airstrikes in Kyiv in the last 24 hours in a sign of solidarity. Hungary and Poland, the same countries whose, again, defining political nature, at least under their governing parties, was control of their borders, strong borders, and their opposition to Syrian refugees, are together accepting millions of people displaced from Ukraine. Get this, Warsaw, the city of Warsaw, the city's population grew by 20% in 2 weeks. But again, this is just 3 weeks in. This is just the beginning. No one knows how long this conflict is going to last. Or, if you look at those images of Kharkiv and Mariupol and Kyiv, how many millions will be displaced? It's a country of 44 million people when the war started. There's a lingering question that's been surrounding this war, pushed by bad faith actors in the American right. Why should I care? Who cares what happens in Ukraine? And what do I have to do with Vladimir Putin? And to those who wonder why they should care, although I suspect most of you watching this understand why, first, I would say that any decent person should probably care when they see suffering on this scale. But even if people like Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance, who said he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine, don't want a moral argument, there is, of course, a practical one. It won't stay in Ukraine. It won't stay in the Russian border. We saw how the fallout from Russia's involvement in Syria dramatically altered politics across the entire world. Right now, Poland is eager to accept nearly 2 million Ukrainians, meaning mothers and children at the border, welcoming them into their homes. But 6 months from now, when that number is 5 million, what will Polish politics look like? What if 20 million people leave Ukraine? When you take a step back, you realize just how central the Syrian war was to bringing us to this moment, and crucially, Vladimir Putin's army's involvement in that war. Because this was what they undertook there, a project, an intentional one, of forced depopulation, intentional civilian targeting, to starve or to surrender, to offer Syrians that choice. And it had enormous geopolitical ripple effects because it drives people out, and then they have nowhere to go. And then everyone else is brought into it. And it's happening again right now.